Vince McMahon has made a lot of strange and questionable decisions over the years, and one of the strangest decisions he's ever made on WWE TV was the time that he apparently thought he turned into a gangster from the streets of Compton, complete with a Durag, and even saying things like, "What up, G?" Yeah, it's a weird one, but it's one which is still remembered fondly by many today for just how completely insane it was. And it all started back at WrestleMania 23, during the Battle of the Billionaires. Basically, the Battle of the Billionaires was the match which saw Vince McMahon and Donald Trump's ongoing feud finally reach a head with them going to war on the grandest stage of them all. But not by getting into the ring themselves though. No, given that we were talking about a guy who'd never wrestled in his life, and another guy who was known for taking the worst Stone Cold Stunner known to man. It was clear that they were going to need substitutes in this fight. So that's how we got Umaga subbing in for Vince, all while then up-and-comer Bobby Lashley filled the role for Trump's proxy. And by the time it came for the bell to ring, the stakes would have been raised even higher, as the losing billionaire was going to have to get his head shaved on live pay-per-view. No prizes for guessing that the future president of the United States wasn't going to go bald that night in front of around 74,000 fans then. No, instead, it would be the WWE owner who felt the wrath of the Shias once all was said and done. And now that he'd lost his locks, he clearly felt self-conscious about his new look, as over the weeks that followed, he'd begin covering up his head with a series of different fedoras. Of course, the fedoras would only be a temporary stopgap though, as a new piece of headwear was about to be unveiled. But before we'd get to that, Vince first had to make it clear to all who would listen that he was out for revenge, and that the person he was seeking revenge on wasn't Donald Trump. No, by this point Trump had gone back to whatever it was he was doing at that point in time. And as for the special guest referee for the bout in question, Stone Cold Steve Austin, well, he had also disappeared from TV. So this meant that the only person left who the boss could take his wrath out on was Bobby Lashley. Yes, we were about to get a Lashley versus Vince McMahon feud. And what would make this one even stranger in hindsight was that it was technically an ECW feud. Why is this? Well, back then, Bobby was an ECW wrestler, or at least he wrestled for the WWE ECW version of the brand, where he served as their world champion. You know, the version that was about as extreme as a cup of tea with no sugar in it. But Vince wouldn't be the only McMahon involved in this feud as it happened, because on the April 9th, 2007 episode of Raw, a mere 8 days after WrestleMania, Shane McMahon also interjected himself into the whole thing, when he challenged the Almighty to another hair versus hair match. Was this a bit unnecessary considering Lashley was already bald? Yes, but who are we to argue with the logic of the late 2000s WWE booking? Anyway, it didn't matter in the end because Shane lost the bout. He and his father and Umaga would all jump their rival before the boy wonder could ever face the scissors. And this post-match attack was all done with a purpose, as it happened because it was designed to set up what was coming next. A 3-on-1 handicap bout at April 29th's Backlash, where the ECW World title would be on the line. And this then would be the moment we'd finally get to see Durag Vince reach his final form, rather than wear his usual ring gear. He'd instead come down to the ring in a black sweatsuit, and you guessed it, a black Durag. Of course, that was a strange enough sight to see, but it'd get even stranger before the night was over. Because after Umaga did the job of beating up the champ, the boss got himself tagged in at the last second in order to get the winning pinfall, and as a result, the title. That's right, Vincent Kennedy McMahon was now the ECW World Champion. We can still hear the sound of 1,000 Philly wrestling fans crying even today. And as if that wasn't bad enough, over the weeks which followed, the boss would begin leaning further and further into his new Durag character by adopting various stereotypically black mannerisms, such as referring to people as G and Holmes, all while taking on an even more dramatic swagger than ever before. It was a bit like watching your dad trying to get into hip-hop after hearing an Eminem song, and thinking, that's not actually that bad. And it was just as cringeworthy and bizarrely captivating as you could imagine. And of course, throughout all this, the one constant was that every time he was on screen, Vince always had his by now trademark Durag on top of his head to cover up his bald scalp, as well as his newly won ECW World title around his waist. That said, If Bobby Lashley had anything to say about the situation, he wasn't going to have this belt for long. After all, the Almighty had lost in such screwy fashion, he was insistent he deserved a rematch. Before he could get this though, Vince, Shane and Umaga would beat up RVD in a handicap match on ECW TV. So as a result of that, at Judgment Day, it would be Lashley versus Vince and Shane and Umaga. Yeah, it was another 3-on-1 handicap match. But after having gone through it once already, this time the challenger knew what he had to do. And that's why, after a lengthy battle, which went on for 1 minute and 15 seconds, he'd hit Shane O'Mac with a Dominator and pin him right in the middle of the ring. That meant that he was once more ECW champion again, right? Well, no, because he didn't pin the champ. This would stay around the waist of Vince. Or at least that's what the boss claimed the rules had always been after the bout was over. Needless to say, Lashley wasn't happy about this, as it meant his boss could continue to parade around the WWE, pouring gasoline onto the legacy of ECW by holding onto their world title. And of course, all the while he was doing this, he still had that by now trademark Durag over his head. So clearly, something had to give at some point. And that some point would be the next pay-per-view of the year as it happened. Because it was there that Lashley got one final shot against Vince, and this time, in a one-on-one bout for the ECW title. But why would the champion ever give him this shot in the first place? After all, he was the one booking the show, so it wasn't like he had to do it, right? Well, thinking he was getting one over on his rival, the boss would tell Bobby he could fight him again at One Night Stand, under one condition. And this condition was that first, he had to go through a grueling gauntlet match that no one could ever hope to win. You can probably guess what happened next then. The babyface beat Chris Masters, Viscera, Umaga, and Shane McMahon all on the same night on the May 21st episode of Raw to book his spot in one of the main events of the upcoming pay-per-view. And to make matters even better for him, this upcoming match was going to be contested under street fight rules. Sure, this did mean Shane and Umaga would be able to interfere. On the flip side, it also meant there were no limits to the amount of punishment Bobby was going to be able to inflict upon his opponents. It didn't matter if it was a steel chair, a trash can, or any other weapon he could find. Everything was going to be legal. And perhaps realising this, on the June 2nd episode of Saturday Night's Main Event, just one day before their showdown, Vince McMahon would attempt to soften his opponent up by challenging him to an arm wrestling contest. And yes, we know what you're thinking. How could he have expected to win against a man with the size of arms Bobby Lashley had? But as we'd all soon discover, he'd planned ahead for that. What was his secret last-minute swerve? Well, it was to replace himself with the world's strongest man, Mark Henry. And once Henry and Lashley were locked up, then Vince attacked his opponent from behind with a steel chair, laying him out in what he hoped was a taste of what was to come the following evening. Unfortunately for the boss, all this served to do was piss off the challenger even more. And so when he arrived at One Night Stand, just 24 hours later, he was pumped and ready to kill. Yeah, the climax to the whole Durag Vince story had finally come, with it featuring the 61-year-old owner of the WWE going against a WWE homegrown project on ECW territory, in the least ECW match known to man. Well, almost, because at least the company had the good sense to make it a street fight, so there was some sense of hardcore action in there. This led to both Shane McMahon and Umaga getting involved at various points. In the end though, neither of them were able to stop the inevitable, and that was the final victory of Lashley, as after numerous chair shots and a spear, the big man put down his boss once and for all at 12 minutes and 23 seconds, ending his Durag-themed reign of terror in the process. What happened next? Well, when it came to the now two-time ECW champion, he'd be moved up to Raw soon thereafter, as WWE continued their plans to seemingly set him up as the next face of the company. Sadly though, before he could reach this level, the relationship between the two sides would break down for some undisclosed reason, and Bobby would request his release from his contract, and he was granted this on February 4th, 2008. As for Vince McMahon, well, he started a new storyline, one which saw him fall into a depression following the loss of the ECW title, And that all climaxed with him apparently being blown up inside his limousine on the June 11th episode of Raw. Of course, before that angle could go any further, however, it would have to be scrapped as just 1 week later, the Chris Benoit murders took place, and everything stopped feeling so fun for a while. But even a tragedy like this couldn't erase one of the weirdest storylines from the Ruthless Aggression era from memory, as in the years since, it's become cemented in man fans' minds as a fever dream moment, which happened despite all logic, saying it shouldn't have. What else would you expect from a guy as insane as Vince McMahon? Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, click here for another, and if you want to become one of the Dawgs yourself, check the links in the description.